You look great. Yeah.
And you can see it full screen?
Full screen looks good.
Okay. Go ahead and start my timer so I stop on time so we have plenty of time for discussion. So thanks for the introduction, Molly. I really appreciate it. And I am truly honored to be invited to speak to this organization. I'm really looking forward to it and looking forward to our discussion afterwards as well. So as Molly mentioned, I am with the Forest Service. I'm with a branch called Forest Health Protection, and we're a part of the state private and tribal forestry branch. There are 5 insect and disease service centers across our region, which consists of Washington and Oregon. And as she mentioned, I sit in the Wenatchee Service Center. So we're able to cover a lot of ground across Washington and a lot of different forest types. So we cover things on the west side all the way to the northeast side. And as Molly mentioned, we work with those federal resource and land managers and provide the forest health expertise and assistance to them. So we're lucky enough to work with the forests, to work with national parks, to work with Native American tribes and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, as well as Bureau of Land Management. And then we get to work with our amazing colleagues at state and extension on projects and collaborative things as well. Okay, so I'm excited to talk about abiotic issues today, and this was kind of fun to put together this presentation because it's not something that I always get to spend like a whole 45 minutes on. So abiotic issues and abiotic forest health issues are caused by non-living damage agents. So I have a list of those common ones over on the left here. So temperature extremes, that can be either too hot or too cold, moisture extremes, that could be too much water or a deficiency of water. You have things like chemicals, like herbicides, nutrient imbalances, often those coexist with soil issues. And then abiotic involves things like mechanical damages, and mechanical damages can be weather related. They can be it can be like a large storm damage. It can be ice damage. It can also, so fire falls into that mechanical damage. And then that's in comparison to those biotic or living damage agents. And those are the things that Rachel Brooks talked about and Molly talked about. Those are our pathogens like fungi, bacteria, and viruses, or insects like bark beetles or defoliators. Even animal damages fall into that biotic damage agent category. So I noticed in Molly's talk that she talked about this sort of disease decline spiral. And so I did want to follow up with that too. So this was sort of proposed by Dr. Paul Mannion, and this is sort of a famous figure. You've seen it before. And basically what it does is it kind of shows all the different factors that may go into a tree dying. So sometimes there's a very aggressive pathogen or a very aggressive insect, and it can kill a tree. But often there's a suite of factors involved in that tree, and things, they might be genetic, they might be site specific, they might be environmental. And so I wanted to kind of put abiotic damages into this spiral so that you could see where they fall. Often those abiotic damages and all the things that I've highlighted on the left in yellow are considered abiotic or non-living damage agents. Those agents usually fall into these first 2 overall categories, so predisposing factors and inciting factors that can lead to a tree mortality. Those predisposing factors are these long-term static factors. So those might be things like a tree's climate, a tree's long-term site. So whether it lives on a ridge top or whether it lives in a valley bottom. So these are these longer term static things that the tree is exposed to. And then those inciting factors are a little shorter term than that, but they cause acute stresses. So things like drought, multiple drought years, maybe a hailstorm, maybe a frost issue. Those are inciting factors. They're either 1-2 punches or 1-2-3 punches that cause more stress to that tree. And then those secondary factors or contributing factors are often those biotic damage agents that may finish off the tree. And if they're not very aggressive, if they're just secondaries, they wouldn't be as successful without those predisposing or inciting factors causing stress on the tree as well. So when we think about abiotics, I wanted to kind of talk about some patterns and generalizations because we're often just out there kind of trying to figure out when an abiotic event occurs, it takes a little bit more investigation to figure out what's going on. So when you think about abiotic damages, often they are across several species. So they're not necessarily host specific. Now, some species are more tolerant or less tolerant to things like water deficit or frost damage. But all trees are susceptible to those abiotic events. And that's in comparison to those biotic damages that are often pretty host specific. So if you think about the pathogen that causes white pine blister rust on our white pine, so that's very host specific. Or if you think about Douglas fir beetle on a Douglas fir, that's very host specific interaction. In both cases, abiotic and biotic, we're going to see symptoms on the tree. Those symptoms, as a reminder, those are the host tree responses to that stress. So that might be foliar necrosis, that might be top kill, that might be branch dieback. But with abiotics, we're not going to see signs or physical evidence of the damage agent itself. And that's different than biotic damages. We are going to usually see signs if it is a biotic or a living thing causing that damage. That would be physical evidence of that damage agent itself. Like maybe that's mushrooms of a fungi causing damage. Maybe that's spores. Maybe that's insect frass. Abiotic damages are often more uniformly distributed. If you think about something like, a storm damage. So that's going to come in, it's going to cause a big shift. It's going to cause a big wind. We're going to lose trees, and they're all going to be in that sort of swath of wind. So that's what I mean by uniformly distributed. Whereas biotic, we often see that sometimes it's uniformly distributed, but often it's patchy on the landscape because it has that host specificity. And the thing with abiotic that's sort of unique is that that damage is often associated with specific geographical or physical features. And I'm going to talk more about this, but maybe we see damage only along trees on a ridgeline or in an elevation band, or maybe we only see trees in this valley bottom. So maybe it has to do with topographic slope. So because often the abiotic issues are caused by these sort of weather or site events, you often can see that pattern on the landscape itself. Whereas biotic damage agents, we often see the damage associated with tree attributes, not so much the site attribute. So think about Douglas fir beetle again. Douglas fir beetle is going to want trees of a certain size. So we're not going to see smaller Douglas fir and larger Douglas fir affected. So I just have some photos here of some pretty common abiotic issues. So again, these are just typical symptoms that we would see on a tree. So that's the tree's response to the abiotic event or damage agent itself, but we're not going to see any signs of a pest. So here on the left, we have a wound, not exactly sure what that was caused by, but we also have a frost crack here. So that's happening when it's cold enough to cause a crack in the bark and in those outer cells, but it's also due to kind of that fluctuation of temperature, right? Because we see those frost cracks on more usually south or west facing sides of a tree. So it means it was kind of sunny and warm enough over there, and then it got really cold. And so that abrupt temperature change could cause that crack. Here in the center, we have fire damage. So that falls into this abiotic category. If you just first walked out here, you might not exactly know what the issue was. Sometimes our foliar pests or cause some of this sort of biotic or bottom-up damage. But as we look at the patterns on the landscape, as we look at the scorch to the foliage, and we look at the char on the bark, we could figure out that it's fire damage. Sometimes things look similar, and it sort of depends on the event itself. So these two photos over here on the right, the sort of late spring desiccation and the frost damage, both of those issues or events seem to cause this necrosis and killing of just the new succulent foliage, so the foliage that had just emerged from the tree that spring, but it was caused by possibly very different things. So the late spring desiccation, this was in a high elevation species. We don't think that it got cold enough to actually cause the frost damage on that particular species. One of the things we sort of hypothesized that happened was that the ground was frozen and we had some warm winds come in on this site, and the tree just kind of started cranking away, trying to push water through, and it eventually dehydrated. Whereas that frost damage down on the lower right there, that can happen when a tree puts out this new growth and it hasn't had time to harden off, and we get a very cold spell for a certain number of hours, and all that succulent tissue can be damaged right away. Herbicide damage or chemical damage falls into that abiotic. What we often see with that is kind of the swelling and strange twisting or curling of these needles or the new shoots when some of this damage occurs. Hail damage is an example of abiotic damage. That's just this one-time event. Essentially, the tops of these twigs are getting pelted with hail and causing these little wounds. And you could see that this is hail damage because it's probably occurring only on the top of the twigs. And also that the wound, you could see it's kind of forming this callus tissue around the wounds there. It's trying to heal itself over. And then another example, and this photo isn't great, but the lower left is these exposed or damaged roots. I actually walk by this tree in Wenatchee a lot, and I'm surprised that it's still alive, but it's like a pinyon pine or something. So it's just got all of these structural roots really exposed to the elements there. So when we're keying into these abiotic damage agents, I have kind of a list here of what we're kind of trying to sort through when we're trying to figure out what might have caused something. So often we're ruling out common biotic pests first. So often we get calls that trees have a bunch of damage, or they're seeing mortality. We'll go ahead and look for those bark beetles, those pathogens, those things first. If we don't see signs of the pests or symptoms only, we're looking for some other patterns. So as I mentioned, often those various species or sizes or ages of trees might be affected. And then we really want to key in on those site patterns. So where are we seeing that damage? Is it limited to a specific topography or elevation or particular slope aspect on the landscape? Often we're trying to figure out what that specific event that occurred was. So we'll go back and try to look at a weather report or a weather data and see if there was a cold snap, see if there was a warm snap or something like that. I would imagine those of you that own land certainly know exactly what's happening on your land. And so you're probably going to key into those a little bit easier than we are if we're trying to cover, 3/4 of the state of Washington. And I have to say that abiotic damage diagnoses are not the most satisfying. Often you have to settle for like a best educated guess of what happened. You're never going to be able, you don't have that like smoking gun, right? You don't have, oh, I've got the pathogen here. I can see that it's causing it. Often we're kind of doing things retroactively and just trying to piece those puzzle pieces together. So I've talked a couple times about looking at geographic patterns when it comes to abiotic, and I wanted to sort of walk through that from small scale patterns on the left to the kind of larger scale patterns there on the right. So on the left, this photo is of what I diagnosed as salt damage on ponderosa pine, and this is the way that I diagnosed this was I looked at the symptoms. They seemed to fit what salt damage or dehydration can do to conifers. They were losing foliage, especially on the bottom of the crowns, and they had tip burn, essentially tip necrosis, with some green foliage on those needles. The patterns on the landscape were that most of that damage occurred downslope from the road, as you can see in the photo, and that damage ended 20, 30 feet from the road, so there was no damage further away from the road. So that was an example of very small scale. I also needed to know that that road actually was there was salt applied on that road, and this is this is between Blewett Pass and Yakima. So we know that a lot of our mountain passes do get de-icing salt application in the winter. The central photo here is an example of what we had diagnosed as winter burn. This was along a ridge this was on Stevens Pass, and so the folks that run the ski resort there called us. They thought they had a bark beetle or something killing mountain hemlock and Pacific silver fir up on this ridge. We went up there and we noticed this pattern where sort of the leeward side of the crowns had all turned necrotic, And this had happened sometime between the winter months and I think it was June by when we went out there. And so this was a difficult one to diagnose. It turns out maybe so after talking with them about the way that the winds come in and what had happened that winter, we sort of diagnosed it that the sides of the trees that were not covered by snow ended up getting more damage through some wind desiccation event. And then the photo on the right, this is an example of what we call red belt damage across an elevation band. So you can see there in the center of the forested part of these hills, we've got this sort of red band. This is necrotic foliage that's showing up from far away. And this red belt is also known as like winter drying or winter desiccation or winter browning. What's happening here is this is essentially attributed to a rapid temperature change or imbalances between the water loss from the leaf and the soil water uptake. So usually this happens in the winter or late spring when the ground is frozen. And so the tree, even if there's water in the soil, the tree can't take water from the soil because the soils are frozen. And if maybe a temperature inversion or something drops right over that elevation band and warms it up enough, or maybe some warm winds come in, and the tree actually starts transpiring. So the tree is going to either start transpiring or it's just going to be losing water, but it's not going to have enough water from the soil to replace it because the soils are frozen. And so when there's a temperature inversion that kind of sits down in that area, we often see it like a band across a hillside. Okay, so these are also, while we were talking about this winter desiccation, I just wanted to show you some photos. And this is one of those cases where sometimes we just don't know the answer. There was a lot of reports in the spring of 2023, so not this spring, but last spring, about these sort of large swaths of trees with this burned foliage, or not burned in the sense of fire consumed, but it was necrotic and looking scorched, and it was multiple tree species like you see here. This was up at this was actually up at Mission Ridge outside of Wenatchee, and then this one over on the right is down on the Yakima Reservation, and some of these photos are what they saw from the air when they were flying our aerial detection surveys. And so this was not as obvious. So it's not like a red band, right? It's not just one elevation, it's multiple species. We don't actually know what happened here, but we know it was something that happened over the winter. One of the theories with what might have happened here is in the fall of 2022, many of you may remember, we were just having this wonderful late fall that was just very nice high temperatures into October. And then all of a sudden it changed and it got cold fast and it snowed. So we had a very short window of fall. Well, if we know that if trees are, their growing season is very long and they're kind of just cranking along and they're transpiring and they don't have a ton of water in the soils, and then they get a cold frost, that they can get damaged that way. So that's kind of one of the theories of what happened in some areas across central Washington last spring. But again, it's hard to figure that out because we don't have soil temperature, we don't have soil moisture measurements, and it's hard to you can look at the weather data, but you can never really have that smoking gun of what happened.
You can, just didn't.
Okay, so we're going to walk through a couple examples. Essentially, I wanted to focus on kind of the moisture extremes that we see here in Washington forests, basically deficiency of waters more so than flooding. I want to talk a little bit about some of the temperature. Okay.
I accidentally muted you, Aunt. I'm so sorry. So sorry.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay. I got a little note. This is the host muted you. Okay. But again, so I'm going to talk mostly about the moisture and temperature extremes, but also keep in mind that, there's a lot more that has to do with abiotics, such as the chemicals, the nutrient imbalances. The mechanical damage category is huge, as well as the issues with those soils. So when we're talking about moisture and temperature extremes on trees, again, those extremes can go either way. We can be talking about too much moisture. So trees can get flooded. And if their roots are getting flooded with water, they're going to have a lack of oxygen. That can lead to tree dieback or death. We often see that in trees that are flooded year after year. You'll just have a bunch of dead standing trees in there. Some species are more tolerant than others. But we can also be talking about too little moisture. So a deficiency of water can either lead to tree root death. So some of those fine roots can die. We can actually see a lack of water transport. So the water just from the soil isn't keeping up with the water needs at the leaf, and that can lead to tree dieback and mortality too. The same goes with temperature. Both excess heat and excess cold can damage tree tissue. That's often, for both of these things, it's related to the timing of the extreme temperature or moisture. So especially with temperature, it depends on the phase of tissue development and the season that we see those high or low temperatures. And then a lot of the winter desiccation or winter burning that we see is because of differences between soil and air temperatures, or those rapid fluctuations in temperatures. So it's not always about the average temperature. So moisture and temperature can affect trees separately. And so we can talk about them separately, but also they're very sort of integral to each other. And so they can be difficult to separate from one another. I would assume that a lot of people have heard this concept of hot droughts. So that's when you have a deficiency in water by whatever metric you're measuring it by. But you also have these high temperatures that are causing more water demand on the trees. And that term has been it's been called hot droughts. And then the precipitation type matters a lot too. And this makes sort of diagnosing these even more confusing, because even if we're getting an average amount, we might have had less snowpack that year. And so there wasn't enough. And then that snowpack might have melted earlier or later. And so those are all affecting sort of the water reserves of the trees, not so much what's happening with precipitation during the growing season. So droughts are not something new to Washington. This is a graph showing the past 25 years, essentially. And this graph is illustrating the percent of area in Washington state that falls into these different drought monitor categories. And those range from none to abnormally dry all the way up to exceptional drought. And so on the y-axis here, we have the percent of the area across the state. And then on the x-axis, we have our years. So you can see almost every year or every couple of years, we see at least a good proportion of Washington in a drought, at least an abnormally dry year or a moderate drought. I do want to point out a couple of specific years here. So this is 2015 to 2016 here, where we see our a large proportion, over 60% of the state for several months was in what was labeled as an extreme drought, or it was red. And then 2021, that growing season, a lot of the state, up to 40% during at least a month or two, was in this exceptional drought. And that's our highest category. And then in 2023, we also had some areas of the state in extreme drought. So all portions of the state can experience drought conditions relative to their norm. It's not just the east side that is experiencing these hot and dry conditions or drought conditions during the growing season. So these figures are illustrative of, I captured what it looked like during the summer of those years that I pointed out on the last slide. So we have summer 2015 on the left. You can see we were split between a severe and an extreme drought across the state when, as of September 1st. Summer 2021 was that year with a lot of exceptional drought. And so it ranged from exceptional over on the east side and a little bit less severe as we got into the west side. Summer 2023, so when these current conditions were mapped in early September 2023, the east side was actually looking pretty good. And then that extreme drought was still occurring in those northwestern counties over on the west side. And then this is what the current conditions were as of May 23rd, 2024 this year. So some abnormally dry to moderate drought conditions. And then just for fun, I went and mapped, and I hope you can see this. I hope it doesn't have the bar over it, but this is the US seasonal drought outlook. So this is the outlook for this summer, essentially through August 2024. And I'll just pull your attention over here to Washington. And it looks like we have drought persisting, at least on the west side of the Cascades and into those lower elevation areas. And the rest of the state is under this drought development likely scenario. And this was the most recent data available on that NOAA website, which is a great one if you want to delve in and nerd out about drought conditions. Whoops. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how trees and water, how trees use water, and then we'll talk a little bit about how drought or lack of water can affect trees. And I know this is probably very basic intro for a lot of people. This is my rudimentary understanding. I'm not a physiologist, but I'll talk a little bit about how drought affect trees, and hopefully I don't get things too wildly wrong. But in general, right, we know that water forms a continuous root to leaf system, right? So we have tree roots absorbing that water from the soil and moving it up through the xylem, which are these sort of conduits or tubes that you see here, and that's in the central portion of our stems. And then water is lost from the leaves via transpiration. And so water is forming that continuous root to leaf system because of its properties. So water molecules are essentially sticky. So they're sticking to each other and they're pulling other molecules in. And so it forms this kind of long chain moving water up the tree via this cohesion tension theory. So it's the evaporation at the leaf that's causing water movement up the xylem that's generating that tension and those chains in the water and pulling more water in at the roots. So as you can imagine, that stronger evaporative pressure from the atmosphere, where it's lower water potential gradient, is going to increase the transpiration and require more water. So the water loss is occurring up here at these tiny pores in the leaves. These are known as stoma or stomata for plural. This is where gas exchange is also occurring. So trees are losing water vapor from that area, and that's where they're pulling in the carbon dioxide and exchanging it for oxygen. And so this photo shows that, or this diagram shows that a little bit more, right? So we have our water moving up in our xylem conduit, and then this figure here showing the stomata in the leaves, or those tiny openings where the water vapor is evaporating and the carbon dioxide is getting taken in. So how does drought stress or a lack of water affect trees? There's essentially sort of these two main strategies about that trees might have, and two main sort of hypotheses about how tree death occurs because of drought. So that includes hydraulic failure and also carbon starvation. So we'll talk about this hydraulic failure first, and I'll go back to this graph first. So remember, we've got our stomata in the leaves, and these are the openings that allow the carbon dioxide uptake, but they also lose water. So plants somehow make the decision to keep those open, or they can close those. If they choose to close those, they're going to retain some of that water, right? They're not going to lose water as quickly. But if they choose to close those stomata, and I say choose in a very broad way, right? So there's reasons why this is happening. But if they close stomata, then they're not taking in the carbon dioxide that they need for all those cellular functions later. So that's where these two ideas come in. So if water conducting cells stay open and they just kind of keep cranking along and they just keep losing the water but keep taking up the carbon dioxide, they might get their water conducting cells blocked by air bubbles, and that leads to embolism, and that's essentially what's called hydraulic failure. And so that's what we can see in this graphic up here on the upper right. And so these are all of those, these are vessels, and in conifers, they're tracheids, right? So these are those xylem, those tubes that water is moving up on. In all of these tubes, the water is moving up just fine on the left. All of them look white and healthy and open. And then you start to see these embolisms form, these air bubbles form in these different tubes. And that's what we see by the progression and the dark color coming in. And those are the air bubbles or embolisms. So eventually no more water is going to be moving up the xylem anymore. And then we're going to lead, that's when you start to get branch death and top kill and things like that. So that's hydraulic failure. And that's what we're seeing with these trees in the graph on the lower right. Those are the dying trees type 1. So that blue dotted line there. So these trees are just cranking along, right? They've got their stomates open. They're not losing any growth. They've got all the carbon dioxide they need, but at some point they pass a threshold and they might die very quickly because of all those embolisms, cavitation, or air bubbles in the xylem. The other way that trees might die because of not enough water is through that carbon starvation, right? So that would be our dying trees type 2 here, and that would be that red dotted line. So these are the kinds of trees that would decide, okay, maybe I don't have enough water, I need to close my stomates. And when I do that, I'm retaining my water. I'm not going to lose my water, but I am going to lose carbon, right? I don't have that anymore. And so you might have some growth losses. You're going to have less energy available for growth, defense, repair, fewer defensive mechanisms or compounds, like maybe it's not producing enough resin. And you might start to see that growth decline over time. And it might take several decades for that tree to die. So in both cases, we're going to see changes in chemicals, sugars, hormones, etc. And that's when we start to see the symptoms, the wilting, the stunted growth, the dieback, top kill, and mortality. And really, so that's what the symptoms of moisture stress look like in the above ground tree parts, right? We're talking about branch flagging, and that means when the foliage gets necrotic or dies. And we see maybe that happens just to scattered branches throughout the crown. That's what we mean by branch flagging. Maybe you see dead tops. Maybe we see foliage actually wilting. Maybe you see some scorching or just the tips burning. Some trees will drop their older cohorts of needles. So the oldest needles will go first. And so they'll have very low needle retention and just hang on to those newer cohorts. And then you start to see kind of a thin crown that way. Or this could just lead to mortality. And that will be with or without these interactions with some of the secondary insects or weak pathogens that wouldn't be able to kill a tree if it were not severely stressed. Okay, so now we talked about kind of how the water loss affects trees, and I want to talk about a story in the Pacific Northwest and specifically that is talking about moisture extremes, essentially. And that story is essentially the Western red cedar dieback that I'm sure many of you are aware of, and this is occurring across Washington and Oregon. And this is sort of directly related to some of those moisture and maybe temperature extremes that we're seeing. I was lucky enough to be involved with the project, and I was with Washington DNR, Oregon Department of Forestry, Washington State University, Reed College in Portland State University, looking at Western red cedar dieback. And so I kind of want to tell a little bit about the timeline and the development of that, and then some of the things that we've concluded after those projects. So the timeline for exploring this this forest health issue, I would say it started in about 2016. We started getting more reports from people that they were seeing unhealthy or thinning or dying Western red cedar. Started to see it out in the woods more, but multiple symptoms were observed. So sometimes it was top kill, sometimes it was a thinning crown, sometimes it was mortality. So various site visits happen, right, with our different partners, state forest health specialists, forest health protection, extension agents are going out and seeing what's going on. We're not finding a biotic damage agent everywhere. So it's not attributed to one specific bark beetle or a wood borer or a root pathogen. And so our aerial detection survey team, which is a collaborative group between Forest Service and our state counterparts, they do a wonderful job of flying wall to wall across forested areas of Washington and Oregon every year. And usually they're able to detect these landscape level tree dieback and mortality. And so they started mapping Western red cedar dieback in 2017 when it started to be reported. However, it was pretty difficult for them to capture all the different symptoms that people were reporting, and it's difficult for them to capture the thinning crowns from the aerial detection. And they do really well with capturing new mortality, but this proved a little bit more difficult. So we knew that we needed more ground truth location information and needed more ground observations and to collect some similar data out on the ground. So I want to show a couple maps first about, well, where it has been noted across Washington. So this is the collection of symptoms, basically, is known as Western red cedar dieback, and that's what they're mapping from the planes as they're flying. So this is a map of Washington, and the gray would be the Western red cedar potential distribution. Anywhere you see a color or a shading other than the gray would be an area or a polygon that they've mapped that has unhealthy or dead Western red cedar in it. Doesn't mean that the whole polygon is full of dead or unhealthy Western red cedar. It just means it occurred in that polygon. And I'll show some close-ups of that in a moment. But this is sort of the timeline of how much acres they mapped since 2017. And what you can see, so the acres affected over on the y-axis on the left is what's important. That's what the bars correspond to. So you can see it started out in 2017 mapping, I don't know, maybe 1,000 acres, and it really jumped up in 2019, 20, 21, and 22. In 2022, obviously, they mapped almost 100,000 acres of Western red cedar dieback. Now, there's some caveats with this data. So I will say that the surveyors got a lot better at noting the detection, noting the signature on the ground, right? So they admittedly got a lot better at it, and so they were able to detect more. So this data, I think, is a combination of it. It did increase on the landscape over time, but our surveyors also got really good at identifying it as well. This is a close-up of some northwestern counties, so Whatcom, Skagit County, and where the Western red cedar dieback was mapped on the different years. This would be some of those polygons. This is San Juan Island, and then some of the lowlands around the Puget Trough area. This is the Olympic Peninsula. You can see it's mapped along these kind of drainages, really prevalently in the Olympics there. And then this is some of the polygons that were mapped in northeastern Washington, and these were mapped. A lot of these were actually mapped on the ground by Melissa Fisher, who is a DNR forest health specialist over there. So we had some goals with kind of this multi-agency survey. So this is kind of the ground survey, the ground truthing. We wanted to determine the geographic distribution of the dieback and also get a better idea of the causal agents of Western red cedar dieback and explore the role of potential biotic damage agents. This map over on the left is showing all of the sites with Western red cedar dieback. And so we were able to combine efforts with Joy Hulber at the Washington State University Extension Group and his iNaturalist project. And so we've got about 600 locations across Washington and Oregon here where we observed the dieback. It was pretty much observed across the distribution of where Western red cedar should be. Some big exceptions where it wasn't occurring at the time in 2021 and 22 down in the coastal or Cascade ranges of Southern Oregon. And I will admit that we did not do a good enough job mapping it over on the coastal range in Western Washington and the Olympic Peninsula. We have more to do there. But we did note that the frequency of the dieback locations was really highest in the low elevation urban corridors in Western Washington and Northwestern Oregon. More so than in some of the higher elevation, like the slopes of the Western Cascades, et cetera. One of our goals was to catalog the symptoms of what we saw and see which symptoms were most prevalent, essentially. And by far, our most common symptom was the thinning crown. Sometimes that crown was sort of an outside-in thinning, and sometimes it was more inside out. So it was hanging on to the newer foliage while releasing the older foliage. That thinning was pretty common even along these water sources, where you would think trees had their roots in the water, or access to the water at least. We saw a lot of newer developing top kills. So I'd say about a quarter of our sites had this top kill. You can see this on the group of Western red cedar here. So these have obviously been dead a little bit longer than the photo on the right. And then we did see mortality. That signature was mostly observed on the west side of the Cascades, though. We did not see a lot of mortality in central and eastern Washington. So when we put all of those sites together, again, we did not note a single biotic damage agent associated with Western red cedar dieback. And unfortunately, we weren't able to really pull out a specific site factor or slope position associated with dieback. What we did note was that when we looked at the sites with dieback and compared those to kind of the elevational distribution of Western red cedar, we noted that the elevation was significantly lower at the sites with dieback compared to the distribution of western red cedar. And that's what you're seeing here in the graph on the right. And so the red circle I have around the Oregon and the Western Washington sites, you can see that in general, those sites with dieback, or the dark blue, or unhealthy, were at significantly lower elevation than the distribution of western red cedar. And then if you look at the graph on the left, if we plot all of those sites together across the known distribution of western red cedar, the sites with dieback in general were in the warmer. So this is mean annual temperature on the x-axis. So the warmer mean annual temperature and lower mean annual precipitation, they all kind of clustered in that warmer, drier area. And so, you know, we did this survey with the entomologists, and I'm a pathologist, but we're the bugs and crud people, right? We're not physiologists. We don't know how to do dendrochronology. And so we partnered with Robbie Andrus and folks at Washington State, Reed College, and Portland State University to do some dendro work and ask questions like, when did the western red cedar actually die? And were there any patterns in the growth? Did it predict western red cedar dieback or death? And then Robbie looked at the correlations between growth patterns and climate at some of these sites, or weather patterns at these sites. And so they investigated how tree growth and dieback of these trees were affected by climate conditions and drought events using tree ring methods. And so this map is illustrating the 11 sample sites across the Pacific Northwest here. And what they did was this paired tree sampling. And so at every site, they wanted to get 10 healthy, 10 unhealthy or thinning, and 10 dead western red cedar. Not everywhere had dead trees, but everywhere that they sampled did have unhealthy trees to pair with a healthy tree. And so they're pairing the similar size tree and a tree basically right next to a healthy tree and comparing the growth patterns of those. And so what I wanted to show here on the lower graph is we've got the year on our x-axis and the number of dead trees on the right, or on the y-axis. And so what you can see from this graph on the bottom is that most of our trees that died in 2017 or 2018, almost 80%. And a lot of those were in these coastal or west side populations. That also coincided with a very warm, dry couple of years or couple of seasons in both the coastal and interior populations of the western red cedar. And this is shown by SPEI, as that standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index. If it's over this line of 0, we're usually talking about warm, dry conditions. And if it's down here, it's this cool and wet. Another thing is that the western red cedar had experienced some of these warmer, drier conditions before, but one of the things that one of the conclusions that they came to was that these multiple years of the warm and dry conditions are not allowing the western red cedar to recover in growth like they had during their exposure to droughts in the past. Another graph that I probably am not the best person to be walking everybody through, but I'll do my best to try, is showing the growth of western red cedar of dead trees compared to those paired healthy trees. And so what this graph is showing is we've got years before mortality on our x-axis. So any year the tree died would be a 0, and then we're going back in time before that. And then we have an annual growth ratio here on the y-axis. So if the growth ratio is 1, it means that the trees are growing similarly. So those dead trees were growing similarly to the healthy trees, as long as that mean kind of hovers around that ratio of 1. And so what Robbie found when he looked at the growth data of trees that died and compared them to healthy trees is that the trees that died were growing significantly slower or less 4 to 5 years prior to the year of death in both the coastal and interior population. And that's what you see when these lines dip below the 1 in the past 4 or 5 years. And then he compared the unhealthy to the healthy trees. Just trees that have not died yet, and found a similar thing. It's a little bit less exciting, but showed that at least in the coastal populations, those ones with dieback have been slowing significantly compared to those healthy trees 3 to 4 years prior to the year that it was sampled, or 2020. And so key findings from that study I have listed here, and I'll just read off some important ones. The Western red cedar trees that died experienced a period of declining growth for that 4 to 5 years prior to their death, and that's an indicator of increasing tree stress and declining physiological function. The reduced growth of the trees was associated with warmer and drier climate conditions in late spring and early summer. So I didn't show you those data, but that paper that I know Molly has provided and is willing to provide has a lot more details of the correlations between climate and tree growth. The warmer, drier summer climate conditions after drought events significantly slowed recovery and reduced resilience of Western red cedar tree growth. And I think that's one of the most important findings from this study, is that these trees had experienced droughts in the past. It's just that they had cooler, wetter conditions after the drought where they could recover in their growth. So they had some time to recover. Whereas if we look at these drought events in the past 10 years, they're not having those cool, wet conditions, time to recover after they've been set back by a drought. So the bottom line of this study is essentially that the recent mortality of Western red cedar trees was related to multiple consecutive years with extended periods of exceptionally warm and dry conditions in summer. Okay, so now I want to move on. We're going to do this a lot quicker. Talk about a story here in the Pacific Northwest related to these temperature extremes. And that has to do with the heat dome that occurred across the Pacific Northwest in June, the end of June 2021. And I want to point out what I'm trying to show with this photo. This is a photo by our aerial survey detection coordinator, Daniel DePinte, and he took this great photo, and this is in the coastal range of Oregon, but this happened in Washington too, where all of the damage associated with this heat dome was occurring on these western sides of the slope, right? So we're not seeing the damage on the east sides of the slope, and it's just really obvious in this photo where that damage is occurring. And so, oops, this slide, it's not really progressing, but what this slide was going to show was sort of the consecutive increasing in heat. And so 3 days of really consecutive new all-time recorded high temperatures occurred at the end of June. These temperatures are associated, I believe, with Portland, Oregon. But it was, again, that high pressure system that just came over and sat over the Pacific Northwest for several days. And it was just so warm throughout the night and then throughout the day. So almost immediately after that, like some people will say hours, but it was definitely less than days, we saw tree crowns across Washington and Oregon started showing this sort of necrotic or bleached foliage. And often that was associated with the west or southwest facing exposures of the crown, like you can see in these photos, or this photo. And that coincides with the sun's location during the hottest time of the day. And so it was attributed to that heat damage and the solar irradiance that occurred during that high heat. So our aerial detection survey team mapped it. They mapped about 230,000 acres across Washington and Oregon. More acreage was mapped in Oregon, but certainly occurred in Washington, and there's probably a lot more on the ground that the actual extent was much larger than what they could map from the air. These are some examples of that foliar damage. So necrotic foliage or almost bleached looking foliage, again, often worse on trees at the edge of the forest, places where that sun and heat combined during that very hot time of the day. These are some photos I took in August of that year. And this was these current year new shoot necrosis. This is Doug fir and western hemlock. And western hemlock, we saw just damage across a lot of different sizes of trees, often on these exposed trees, and they would often drop those needles right after they turned necrotic. We also saw damage on western red cedar, like you can see here up close on the left, and on this roadside tree on the right. Again, it was the west facing sides of these more exposed trees is where we saw the damage. You can see that in this photo too. The west side of these crowns appear to have the most necrotic foliage. I should say that most of these trees, we don't think that they died. They recovered. They probably put out new growth the next year. And so it's important to monitor these situations, but this didn't automatically lead to any tree death that we know of. This is some photos just showing the 3 different species. So this is Pacific silver fir, western red cedar, and western hemlock right next to each other with the same pattern of damage. And then this is showing, again, so with Douglas fir and some of those other, mostly Douglas fir or Pacific silver fir, you saw this necrotic foliage and it tended to hang on to it throughout the season, whereas the western hemlock, essentially the foliage turns necrotic or turned bleached, and then it dropped it really quick. So this was by August, so this was just 2 months later. And then you're just left kind of looking at these fine twigs, and if you didn't know what happened, you wouldn't have that foliage to help investigate your story. So we know that physiological changes happen due to heat, because there's a lot of study on kind of how fire affects foliage. But I did want to point out this particular paper that I think is a great paper that kind of goes into showing how heat was the main causal agent of the scorched foliage in the heat dome effects in Washington and Oregon. And a lot of that was based on the patterns. They have some really good data in this paper about of temperature gauges throughout a tree crown in an experimental forest. So just showing that that tree crown can get a lot higher than the air temperature. And so they were sort of, there was some back and forth between them and another author about whether this was like water loss or heat damage. And I think they did a really good job kind of pointing out that heat damage was one of the main causal agents of the scorched foliage due to the patterns of the foliar damage and combination with that solar irradiance. And I thought they had an interesting bottom line, and I've highlighted it yellow here, is that one of the most certain predictions of climate models is an increase in the frequency, duration, and intensity of heat waves with climate warming. I'm gonna skip all of this. As far as management recommendations with these abiotic related diebacks, there's a lot of unknowns, right? But I do want to list some of the things that I think are important. Avoid planting high proportions of certain tree species in areas where you note it dying. This seems obvious, but I think it's kind of a hard pill to swallow that if maybe Western red cedar isn't doing well on your land now, that it might not do well there in 50 years. And I don't think that's what people want to hear, but that may be the case. So certainly diversifying and planning for more age and species diversity is important. But we don't want to be planting trees that are either on marginal sites or that we know have had drought-related diebacks. Sorry, my dog's starting to bark here. It's important to plant appropriate drought-tolerant species and seed sources. So keeping it as local as you can, or maybe moving into a slightly drier source than local, but also be cognizant of possible issues with off-site seed sources. Thinning to reduce water stress is obviously a very important tactic and can provide the tree with more growing space. Avoiding additional stressors or growth, so avoiding fertilizer or pruning to stimulate new growth is probably a good idea during some of those drought periods. If you can water, if possible, I know we can't water the forest, but if you're able to water, that could prevent loss during extreme temperature fluctuations and drought. It's important to follow those BMPs for slash management because we don't want to also be bringing in secondary beetles during drought conditions. And I think it's important to keep recording locations of dieback and mortality so we can learn from it and being flexible and adapting as we learn more. There are some great resources available through University of Washington, the Earth Lab. There's one for small forest landowners in Western Washington and also small forest landowners in Eastern Washington. I think this is a good summary of some of the available resources. There's some good stuff about biotic damage agents that are common in here as well. And also one of the great things in here is the table of tree species in the appendix. It describes relatively the tolerance to low soil moisture and also the shade tolerance compared to one another, and provides some sort of notes on management considerations for both east side and west side trees. And I think I am going to wrap up. I had a little bit on road salts and herbicides, but I get so excited talking about drought and heat damage and all those things that I went on too long. So thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate it. I know we went a little bit long, and hopefully we have a little bit of time for questions.
That was incredible. Thank you so much. I so appreciate the depth that you went into on all of those topics, and also the clarity in which you communicated it. I think I don't know, you seem to be two steps ahead of many of the questions that we received in the chat box, because you went on to answer them before they were even addressed. So
Okay.
that was an incredible talk.
Oh, thank you,
Yeah.
Kelly. That's so nice.
So it is 7, and Betsy, I don't want to keep you any longer than we already have. So I was wondering, I mean, would it be okay if I just sent you, there's about 5 or 6 that we've gotten. So could I send you just the list of questions, and maybe you could
Absolutely.
answer them? Okay, that
Yes, and
that
I
would
don't
be
want to take anyone's time either, but I'm certainly can be available for a little bit longer if you want to talk about some of the questions.
like 10 more
Absolutely.
minutes.
Or if people want to get off, I totally understand too. And I really apologize. When I practiced that talk, it was quicker, but
Do not apologize. I mean, I took up plenty of time in the beginning, and it was all really great information. So if you are okay staying around, let's call it
sure.
like for 10 more minutes. Then if you guys need to go, that's fine. All of this Q&A section will also be recorded, so you can check back and watch it there. So I'm going to start at the beginning. So it's going to be a bit more general, and then you will have some Western red cedar dieback questions specifically towards the end that we'll get to. So let's see. Oh, someone wanted to know, are trees killed by heat or cold harvestable for sale? I thought that was an interesting question.
Yes, although you need to make sure that they were killed by one or the other first, because a lot of the frost damage is only going to be to those younger. I mean, you are going to see some reduced growth, but it's not necessarily going to kill a tree just one event. So I would certainly make sure that it's actually dead. But yeah, there's no reason why it wouldn't be harvestable, unless I'm
Great point.
misunderstanding the question.
No, I think that was an excellent answer. And remember, folks, that often tree death is a result of several different factors, as Betsy talked about. How long do exposed roots take to kill a tree? Um,
Again, that's another one that they might not, the tree might not die with exposed roots, right? It just has to get to a point where you either have structural loss because it's not grounded in, it's not providing that structural stability. But like that tree I showed that was in that like lawn, as long as they're watering that tree and the roots aren't actually dying above ground, I think a tree with exposed roots, as long as it's well watered, can live for a very long time.
no. Okay, that's a great answer.
Also a follow-up is that if the roots are exposed, they're more likely to be damaged. And so if you start damaging all the structural roots, you're going to get more dieback and probably get to mortality faster.
That's a good point too. Yeah, they mentioned, say, if they also get flooding in the winter on top of being exposed. So it sounds like that could kind of go either way.
Yeah,
Depending.
I'm not sure if the roots being exposed would it would be any different if they're getting flooded or not. Because when they get flooded and the soil gets flooded, it's just like they're above ground. I mean, it's just a lack of oxygen.
Oh, yeah, sure. Does closing stomata stop or slow cavitation?
Um, it slows, yes. Yes, closing your stomates is a strategy to avoid cavitation. Does it stop it? Probably not. And it also, I should say that the whole idea of like hydraulic failure versus carbon starvation, it's probably not just either or, right? So it's probably a combination of both things are happening. And so trees that get embolisms and cavitation probably also do some closing of their stomata as well. So, but it certainly does stop water loss from the tree. And so the tree is hanging on to water longer if they're closing those stomates.
Well said. I really enjoyed that part of the presentation, like going through the physiology, the mechanical reasoning for so many of the symptoms that we are used to seeing. I was really unfamiliar with that, and it seems so simple. But like, why have I not investigated this further? That was a really interesting part of the talk. I appreciated you getting
Oh,
into
cool.
that.
Cool. It's
Um,
fun to think about that.
yeah, yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, flagging. Like, what's the root of that?
Yeah.
Um, oh, so someone noticed, so the Western red cedar dieback maps, those really cool maps that you showed us, they wanted to know if the mapping is from aerial photos or if you're using LiDAR to measure the foliage. Do you know?
So the maps are from our aerial detection team. So it is literally a group of people in an airplane flying low and they're looking for those symptoms on the ground. So it's people actually in the plane circling the areas with damage on the ground. I think there's been some work trying to use the satellite imagery. I don't know how well it's going. I just because it's kind of a hard set of symptoms to pick up. It's not flashing out bright red necessarily. That thinning crown has been kind of difficult to see in the satellite imagery. I don't know if they would be able to see it with LiDAR data or not. That's kind of interesting. But most of it is from our aerial detection survey team.
And I know that Rachel Brooks, she is on the aerial survey team for the DNR. I don't know, Betsy, do you go up in those tiny itty
I
bitty
do not
planes too?
go up in the planes. I have not done it yet. Yeah, Rachel is on that team, and a lot of our entomologists do it because they're mostly picking up insect-related damage, so things that kill the tree very quickly, and they can pick up that new mortality. But they
Yeah.
also um, do very good job picking up some of the more subtle signatures like this. And I think Rachel provided it, but if we do have there's a forest health report for Washington in 2023, and that has a lot of info about the ADS surveys and what
Oh,
they find as
yeah.
well. And we can provide those links again too.
Yes, yes. Good point. Good point. I think let's just do one more, and then I'll email you. There's a couple that have just come in that I haven't had a chance to look at yet, but we'll distribute that to the class with the links we mentioned and the recording as well. So pretty general question, but I think an important one. Is there concern for other trees to follow the cedar in the climate stress death? Curious what will happen in 2026, 5 years after the 2021 heat dome.
It's a good question. I don't think I know the answer to it. It's a
Yeah.
really good question. I mean, we already have seen some other species other than Western red cedar be affected by hot, dry conditions. The big leaf maple, there's been a paper out on that. They didn't link that to a specific or biotic organism. That was mostly due to an increase in warmer, drier years. I know we haven't studied it, but Western hemlock seems to wink out a little bit after we have these big drought years. Sometimes that's associated with some secondary beetles and things like that. But the Western red cedar was an interesting example because it does have some I think it's a wood borer, right? The cedar bark borer. Anyway, I shouldn't be talking about insect names, but it doesn't really have an insect that will kind of attack and kill it, right? And so it was this sort of unique example. A lot of our other tree species, when they get stressed, they do bring in those insects and things. And so it's sort of hard to disentangle what's killing the tree. But even if it is an insect that's causing the damage, yeah, I think that we're going to see it more often with more species due to these increased longer growing seasons, higher frequency of drought after drought within those consecutive years.
It's just lowering the tree's defenses, making it
Yeah,
stressed out, and more prone to damage from other factors.
yeah.
Um, that's really well said. Oh, Nick Coons, who is he works at the Skagit Conservation District. He it's mentioned Pacific yew. Have you heard anything going on with the yews? I mean, I know they're not
No.
terribly common. Nick, if you want to unmute, feel free to jump in and elaborate what you were talking about. Um, and also,
Yeah.
oh,
Hey,
sorry, go ahead. Hi.
no, so I have a friendly debate going on with another colleague. about whether or not it's excessive water or a lack of water that's discoloring the foliage in Pacific Yews. So this is out in the west end of Skagit. I'm seeing a lot of it. I know where some of the yews are, so it's kind of interesting. What could be causing that?
Huh.
Yeah, that's one of those investigations. You got to look at the site patterns. You got to figure out, is it, is the color changing on the years that it's getting a lot of water? I mean, that's one of those really difficult things to try to figure out.
Yep.
That's a really great observation.
Let me know. Now I'm
Yeah.
interested, Nick.
Yeah.
I've only
Yeah.
seen, I've seen some yew that just has been totally hammered because it was planted in this very dry place where they took the overstory off, and it was just sort of an experimental thing. And that was in northeastern Washington. But other than that, I don't really see yew that much while we're out. So keep us posted.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. And also, our another DNR representative and a woman owning Washington leader, Holly Haley, also just shared a link of that final report that Betsy was just mentioning. So if you scroll up just a little bit in the chat box, you can find that there. Okay, I'm going to call it. This has been tremendous. So grateful to you, Betsy, and to all of you who joined us this evening. Like I said, we'll be sending a follow-up email with some helpful resources and links. Keep an eye on our Facebook page, and if you have already joined our mailing list, then I will send updates to you through that as well. But I think this is a really great first series, and I'm so happy to have met so many of you. And thank you so much.